almost every Thursday here at Wooddale, sponsored by a new ministry that we have called the Family Resource Initiative. Almost everything that you see us do on Thursdays are events that we are also willing to bring on the road from time to time. So we bring in different counselors and experts and a variety of different topics, pastors, community leaders, business leaders, to speak on a number of topics. And it really is our goal to bless our community and just to give this as a gift to people in our community. And so if you have enjoyed this, or you see maybe a previous topic that has been talked about and you're intrigued about that, we'd love to give that as a gift to our community. We have started recording these as well, and so we will be putting those up on our Family Resource Initiative website, and that is at familyresource.info, and you'll begin to, in a couple of weeks, see a resources page there with a number of our past lunch and learns, and you'll see those starting to populate weekly on that site as well. So today's topic is a really, really important topic, and it's the topic of mental health. It's not just in your mind. One of the areas that our Family Resource Initiative deals with is the whole area of mental health. In the past month, we've given, I think, 14 counselor referrals to people, and so oftentimes as a result of coming to a lunch and learn or just finding out about the Family Resource Initiative through a number of different ways, people call in, people say, hey, can you give me a referral? Our speaker today is one of those people I love to refer people to. She's an incredibly competent therapist, and in 25 years as a Christ-focused counselor and in pursuing her own healing, Daphne DeMaris is somebody who learned to address healing in the body as well as the mind, the emotions, and the spirit. She has a telehealth practice, which is really kind of a newer concept in counseling, and for many of you, that may intrigue you. In the Q&A time, if you have questions about that, feel free to ask about that. That serves adult individuals and couples in Florida, Maine, Michigan, and Minnesota. She's been a speaker for close to 30 years to audiences, churches, women's events, and she also works with healing retreats and more. Daphne is involved here in the ministry at Wooddale Church. What she didn't put in her bio is she was also an ordained pastor. And so somebody who has just ordained, is that fair? Ordained pastor in the Covenant denomination before coming to Wooddale. And so we're really, really, really blessed to have Daphne with us today. Here's how today's going to work. She's going to present for about 45 minutes. And then if you have questions, we're going to have a time for Q&A. And right before we go to the Q&A time, we always do a giveaway each week, and so we'll creatively give something away before our Q&A time today. And today is a Seven Corners coffee tumbler, so we'll give that to one of you today. And then we're going to let you know at the very end about a schedule change for the first week in May, and then a little bit of a preview for our summer Lunch and Learn series. So this will not be going away in the months of June and July and August. We're going to continue to ramp this up because all of these issues don't take a break just because it's summer. So let me invite Daphne to come on up.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming out today. I literally could talk for days and hours about mental health and how I learned to pursue my own healing, and how in 25 plus, I've rounded the corner on 25 and headed toward 26 now, how I've learned to help people find the healing that Jesus already won. And so I just want to say that Jesus already won our healing. He took a beating within an inch of his life. The Bible tells us, by his stripes we are healed. And I believe that we have a duty to pursue that healing, right? The Bible says, take hold of that for which you have been taken hold of in Christ Jesus. And I think part of that is the healing that he already won for us. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the subject of healing and all of the things that I went through in my own life that I've had to work on healing, and still am. I still have a counselor. I still am working on myself because I cannot lead where I haven't been, right? So, all right, let me just start with this. You know, when we hear mental health, we think that it's what goes on in the mind that impacts our emotions. And that actually is only one of the factors in the equation. And today I'll address multiple aspects of our personhood and how we may need to look to each one of those aspects in order to become as healthy as possible. But first, I like to address a few foundational premises from which I operate. So yeah, I've been a therapist for 25 plus years. I had the good grace of God who directed me to seminary. So I have a master's in clinical pastoral counseling. We were taught how to integrate biblically in our program, which I'm super grateful for, because if I don't know the Bible, I don't know what lines up with the Bible. And if I'm using interventions or techniques that don't line up with the Bible, then I'm going to be inviting even more warfare into my clients' lives. And that's the opposite of what I want to do. The enemy has a lot invested in keeping us stuck. He doesn't want us to operate in the freedom of Christ, does he? So that's why it's important for me to know this. I had to learn how to do battle for myself, and I have to teach clients how to take their stand and do battle for their own healing. Excuse me. So, like, from the very first moments of my 600-hour practicum, which every grad program has a practicum, and then during the 3,000 hours of supervised experience that I was meant to have after I graduated and prior to becoming fully licensed, I had virtually no actual supervision. Like, I was supposed to be supervised, I was supposed to meet regularly, but I was left to my own devices. And you know what that did? It drove me to my knees because I didn't want to harm my clients. And really, the only thing I knew when I graduated was how to pass exams and write papers. You don't learn how to be a counselor until you're a counselor. And so it was in those days and months and years, 3 to 5 years, I would say, just to become proficient at what I was doing. But I had to get on my knees. So God was my supervisor, and God is still my supervisor. I'm in private practice. I don't have a human supervisor. I have sought consultation over the years when I get stuck with something. I mean, that's just a wise thing to do. I'm not an expert on everything. But let me tell you, my first client was someone who was sexually abused by her mother. She was abandoned by her father. And that was just the beginning of her life. Later on, after a lot more trouble and, experiences and grief and loss, when she was in college, she dated a witch who was preparing her to be an altar. You know what that means? She was going to be sacrificed. That was my first client. I was not prepared. I mean, I was prepared spiritually because I knew that God could heal her. I wasn't afraid of what she had gone through. I wasn't afraid that she would never get healing. I knew that God would heal her. And I'd say that faith is my biggest asset in addition to, my experience. But the description that I just gave, that's what we think of when we think of trauma, isn't it? Like, when we think of trauma, we think capital T, trauma. But there's a lot more to trauma than the extreme things that we think of. So I'm going to start with using the word wound. Trauma can be a wound. It can mean anything from a scrape to a broken bone to a gunshot wound. It can take root inside of us from harshly spoken words from our parents that we can't get out of our head, to an ongoing string of psychological and verbal abuse, to anything that could be physical, hidden cuts, bruises, burns, to the worst, most heinous acts of sex trafficking and torture. Anything from little t trauma to capital T trauma. Wounds happen when we get something we don't need, which falls under the rough heading of abuse. Wounds also happen when we don't get the things that we legitimately do need, and that falls under the rough heading of neglect. So there are certain things that we all need in order to move forward in life in the healthiest way. And this is not to mention the damage that comes from the coping skills that we develop in order to try to protect ourselves after we've been wounded. Avoidance, addictions, denial, those kinds of things. So I'm gonna give you my thumbnail definition of trauma. And that's anything that happens that's beyond our ability to cope with it. I'll say that again. Anything that happens that's beyond our ability to cope. And that we're unable to verbally process around the time that the wound happens, that the trauma happens. And let me tell you, little kids don't have coping skills. There's a myth that kids are resilient. Resilient means returning to the previous state. But once the wound happens, once the trauma happens, we don't go back to the previous state because wounds and traumas change the way that our brain functions. And therefore it changes the way that our body functions. So this is one of the reasons that I say mental health is not just in our head. It's not just the things that we think, although I'll talk about that more later. Because when wounds happen and trauma happens, trauma sits down in our bodies, and it can wreak a lot of havoc, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. You know, obviously kids aren't the only ones who experience wounding, but when we're looking for the root cause of dysfunction, we have to go back to the earliest state to uproot what began to grow there, and when we experience the wound, in order to reclaim that territory. And this is language that I use with my clients all the time. We're going to reclaim the territory. Psalm 16 says, God has drawn the boundary lines for us in pleasant places, and in him we have a delightful inheritance. And so that's why I say he's given us the territory of our lives, and we can reclaim it, and we can make it fruitful. So, wouldn't you know, dry mouth. Now, if the wounding happens in adolescence, that could be problematic too, because lots of adolescents think, well, when it's over, I'm done, I'm okay, I'm fine. You know, a lot of adolescents don't have the ability to think into the future and see the big picture. They just think it's over, so I'm fine, I'm done. The truth is that just because the abuse stops or the wounding stops, or maybe it was a one-time event, doesn't mean that it hasn't impacted you and that it isn't still kind of causing you to believe certain things and act in certain ways that then can compound the wounding and the harm. And whatever we learn to believe about ourselves impacts how we act, the choices that we make, and either healthy or unhealthy. So the truth is we can tolerate our wounded state for about 15 to 20 years before things really start to disintegrate. And that disintegration can look like relational distress, the inability to have secure emotional attachments, trouble performing at work, perfectionism that makes others around you a little bit crazy. It can also look like digestive problems, asthma. Asthma is rooted in anxiety, diabetes, high blood pressure, migraines, or TMJ. And obviously, it can definitely look like depression and anxiety and addiction. So I want to talk a little bit about the types of trauma. There's type A trauma, which a lot of people don't recognize happened to them, but they don't know that this is causing some of the emotional distress that they're experiencing. And then there's type B trauma. So, excuse me, type A trauma is under the heading of attachment wounding. Researchers estimate that approximately 50% of people have enough wounding to create insecure attachments. 50%. Where can we look in culture for the impact of that 50% attachment wounding? Divorce rates. If we don't learn to attach to our primary caregivers in healthy ways, we don't learn to attach to ourselves in healthy ways, and then it's much, much harder to attach to others in healthy ways. You know, we may be trying to get our needs met through them, we may be trying to control them. There's just a lot of ways that this can show up in our lives. So think of Romans 12:2 that says, I appeal to you, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be renewed by the transforming of your minds. When we hear that passage and we think, don't be conformed to the world, we think the world, right? We think of the culture, but what's our first world? Our first world is our family of origin. That's where our identity begins to form. So like I would say, the things that I learned about myself and my family, a DeMaris always, a DeMaris never. Things that were spoken over me by my parents or other relatives. They impact us for better or worse for the rest of our lives unless we learn to, again, reclaim that territory, unless we recognize, oh, that's right, my mom said this to me or my dad said this to me, but that's not actually true. What is the truth? I want to operate out of truth, right? Doesn't the Bible tell us that the truth will set us free? It's not just the truth of who Jesus is. That sets us free from sin and death, but any truth has the power to set us free from any corresponding lie that we've learned to believe. And I'm going to talk more about thoughts in a little while, so attachment wounding is the absence of. It's the absence of basic care and nurture. Food, clothing, shelter, medical care, dental care, having your mental health needs met. It's the absence of feeling securely attached on a consistent basis. So if you have insecure attachments, first 4 years of my career, I worked in adoptions. And there's a ton of research about what I'm about to say, specific to adoptions, but it can happen in our own families of origin too. And that is insecure attachments can take place as early as the womb. If a mother doesn't attach to their baby in utero, if they're not thinking warm, loving thoughts about that baby, it can cause developmental problems. And this is scientifically proven. I'm not making this up. So in any case, other things that are absence wounds would be feeling cherished and delighted in. When our parents notice and encourage us to develop our unique gifts and talents. And then they show up for our games. They show up for our recitals. They don't just pay for it and send us off. We know they're interested in us. That's a way that they show love. Appropriate affection. I've had so many clients who talk of stoic parents who showed no affection and spoke no words of love to them. Even so, a lot of those clients would say, I had a good childhood. I grew up on a farm and we always played with the animals and we had lots of cousins around. None of that replaces our genuine need for the love and affection of our parents. And I'm going to say this, I never vilify parents, right? Every parent, most parents, do the best that they can. And that's not a cop-out statement. Some people say, oh, that's a cop-out. It isn't, because if they could do better, they would, right? We can't give what we don't have. So if they were raised by stoic parents, they didn't have it modeled for them, and if they think, it's fine, I'm fine, then that's what they're going to give you. So anyway, I don't vilify parents, I never do. Another thing that could be an absence wound is healthy and safe boundaries and limits. And this can go both ways. Overbearing parenting and unsafe boundaries. I had a client who's 16, her father strip searched her because he thought she was smoking pot. I'm sorry, that's sexual abuse. You don't strip search your 16-year-old daughter. Or the lack of boundaries and limits. One of the most anxious clients I ever worked with, her parents just left her to her own devices. They're like, we trust you, we know you can make your own good decisions. She's 10. She's 5. She's 15. That produces great insecurity. Kids need to know the limits. They need to know the boundaries. It's safer for them that way. Another obstacle is being coached on how to deal with hard things. If parents solve all the problems and they don't help their kids learn how to overcome those obstacles, that's a handicap for the future, and that produces anxiety. You're going to hear a theme because I'll be talking a lot about anxiety. It's an epidemic. Finally, opportunities to develop personal resources. Hearing from parents, money's tight, we don't have enough money for that. Kids can't handle that. That's an adult concept that parents need to keep to themselves, even if there are issues. Like, I remember growing up, I never heard about money growing up, but I remember my mom tearing napkins in half. You know, that didn't register to me as we're poor, we don't have enough of what we need, right? But if I were hearing we don't have enough of what we need, that would instill anxiety in me. So when we grow up in a deficit of these things, the result is wounds that seem harder to heal because they're harder to recognize as wounds, right? We think that's just normal. And normal is a mathematical word that means what happens on average. So everybody's average is a little bit different, but normal and healthy are not the same thing. So I always want to help my clients to aim for healthy. Because so few people are aware of how these seemingly littler things impact them, they mentally minimize the impact. And they won't seek help because they don't recognize that it actually caused harm. I always tell clients that what happened was bad enough. It doesn't have to be a gunshot wound. It doesn't have to be rape. It was bad enough to cause some problems and leave painful emotional residue behind. So one thing that I might have said growing up is, yes, my dad was an alcoholic, but he wasn't a raging, angry alcoholic, and I wasn't afraid of him, and we always had our basic needs met, so it must not really have been that bad. P.S. and by the way, even though I can't remember a time when I wasn't anxious or depressed. So, you know, we have to learn how not to minimize what happened to us. We don't have to glorify it either. You know, we don't want to give the enemy more glory than he's already gotten out of what happened to us. But we have to look at what actually happened, how it actually impacted us, and how it might still be impacting us, and then work on that. How do I get healing? Type B trauma is what we all think of as trauma, like the example I gave earlier about my first client. Those are very bad things that should never happen. Most people with type B trauma, which I just addressed, most people who have type B trauma have also already experienced type A trauma. But this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that are type B trauma: physical abuse, violence, spanking that leaves bruises, and emotional scars, sexual abuse, including inappropriate touch, language, voyeurism, not respecting physical boundaries. I had a client whose mother would always walk in on her when she was showering as a teenager. That's not okay. That's not okay. Being exposed to pornography, all of these things come under the heading of sexual abuse. Verbal and emotional abuse: you'll never amount to anything, you're so stupid, oh, you're the pretty one, your sister is the smart one. All of those things sit down inside of us and continue to work on us until we overcome those. Abandonment by a parent, obviously being trafficked, tortured, ritual, satanic abuse, witnessing someone else being abused, like a child witnessing a father beating a mother, those kinds of things. After hearing all this, we can't help but think that Jesus was not kidding in the least when he said, "In this world you will have trouble." But thankfully, he didn't drop that on us and then not give us any hope, because he went on to say that we can have peace because he has overcome the world. And because he has overcome the world, we can overcome the world. When I tell my clients about this, that when we are in Jesus, not just I know Jesus, but we're actually pursuing him. We actually have a active faith. And that doesn't mean we don't have doubts and fears, but it means we're pursuing Jesus, that we can have access to hope. Jesus offers himself and the healing that he won for us. These are the things that are my foundational principles and beliefs about what impacts us, what roots down in our bodies and minds. And now I'm going to talk about each aspect of personhood and how they're impacted by what we experience. I'll also talk about how God has shifted how I operate with clients as I begin to integrate these things. Because when I first came out of grad school, I was just really working with clients based on what I had learned in grad school. And it was some time before I realized for some clients, I just wasn't seeing, and they weren't seeing the progress that they hoped for. And that's because there are other factors in the equation that needed to be addressed. So earlier I touched on Romans 12:2, don't be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be renewed by the transforming of your mind. So the mind, this is our battlefield, right? For most of us, what we think impacts how we feel and how we act. And so if we're believing things that aren't true, then that's going to impact our emotions. We're going to struggle with depression or anxiety, maybe anger, irritability. But once we learn to line our minds up with what's true, then we can overcome that obstacle. So all of the things that I mentioned while discussing wounds and trauma inform the way that we think about ourselves, the world, and God, and we can learn to believe things that are true. So when we experience those type A traumas, we might learn to believe, I gotta look out for number one. Nobody took care of me, so I have to take care of myself. So we can grow up selfish. We can grow up thinking, how do I get my needs met through other people, and not as much about how can I be a good person in the relationship too. We might not even recognize that we're thinking those things because it's so deeply rooted inside of us, and it's not just a primary need that hasn't been met. It becomes needy, like I need. And so we compulsively go around trying to get our needs met from other people, or we look to substances, alcohol, pornography, shopping, workaholism. There's all kinds of things that we can turn to in order to try to get our needs met through the world. That's never going to satisfy, and it's never going to heal the wounds. If a parent leaves and divorce happens when children are around age 5 or 6, that's the developmental stage where kids feel responsible for everything. And they may learn to believe that their parents' divorce is their fault. And there's no healthy adult would tell a kid, you're responsible for my divorce. I have had clients whose unhealthy parents have told them that. And we have to undo the damage of that, because it simply isn't true. Kids are not responsible for what adults do. If a sibling has profound mental health issues or physical health issues, the other child or children can learn to believe that they either have to act out in order to get attention, or that they have to be perfect because they don't want to cause their parents any more problems. And then we see that perfectionism or that acting out taking its course through the rest of the life. But again, it comes back to what we learn to believe about ourselves that dictates our actions. So later in life, say a girl has an abortion, she may learn to believe that she has committed the unforgivable sin. And even if she believes intellectually that God says he forgives, she may feel, and I've heard many clients endorse this, yeah, I know God heals, but I don't see how he can heal me. and I can't forgive myself. So that is a big inhibitor for being healthy and having healthy relationships, because then we have a secret, we have this shame that is rooted down deep inside of us. But it simply isn't true, right? Because God says if you confess that he's faithful to forgive you and cleanse you from unrighteousness. And I've talked to clients about that, and they're like, I know, but I can't forgive myself. And because I do use humor with my clients, once I've established a good rapport and safety with them, I'll say, so your standards are higher than God's? And people are like, oh, I never thought of it that way. I said, really, God has already forgiven you. You need to agree with that forgiveness. You need to receive that forgiveness and let it change you. There's nothing that is insurmountable to God to heal. Absolutely nothing. So, let's see. I'm looking at the time. I wanted to tell you about this book that I recommend to clients, and it's called The Lazarus Life: Spiritual Transformation for Ordinary People. And it's by Stephen W. Smith, Stephen with a PH, not a V. In it, he talks about how Lazarus came stumbling out of the grave after being in there for several days, still wrapped up in his grave clothes. He could not remove his grave clothes by himself, right? He was basically mummified. He needed his community to help him get unwrapped. But one of the lines in that book I'll never forget, I wish I could remember currently in useful information, but I remember this. He said, when Lazarus came out, he'd been in there for 3 days, and he'd begun to stink a little bit. And because of our wounds, we stink a little bit too. We might not be aware of it, but the people around us are. The people close to us are aware of how our wounds show up. Our woundedness is just as stinky, and we need to get unwound from our grave clothes. Let's see. We know that stress is also a big problem, and one of the most stressful things in our lives can be our thoughts, because they dictate how we handle the circumstances that we encounter in everyday life. I have a worksheet that I use with clients, and it comes out of an adolescent homework planner, but I like it because it's 5 pages, and most people would rather have a 5-page worksheet to identify something than a 365-page book, on the entire cognitive therapy and all of that. I've only had one client who was like, no, I want the book, but the worksheet identifies 13 common types of distortions. So like all or nothing thinking, it's either this way or this way, nothing in between. Exaggerated thinking, everything, always, never, nothing. Mind reading, I know they said that, but what they really mean is this. And so on and so forth. Catastrophizing, forecasting, predicting things are going to turn out poorly. Most of us has some stinking thinking. And that stinking thinking can wear away at us. It can create anxiety, it can create depression, it can increase anger, like when you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off and you're like, don't be a jerk all your life, Minnesota drivers are the worst, I always get cut off. We don't even know we're thinking those things. It's so automatic. In fact, one of the phrases that we use in counseling is ANTs, automatic negative thoughts. They're so automatic that we don't even realize we're doing them. But we recognize, now I'm bent out of shape. I feel angry, I feel irritable. And so if we can go back to identifying what our thoughts are, we can learn to say, is that true, by examining the evidence. So I had this client who said to me once, I'm a complete failure. And I said to her, prove it. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, if you're a complete failure, there's going to be lots of evidence. And she said, I still don't understand what you mean. I said, okay. You flunked out of school? Of course not. I graduated with honors. Well, you don't pay your bills, and your car was repossessed, and your house is in foreclosure. No, I'm responsible. I pay my bills on time. Oh, well, you didn't pass your licensing exam for her career. No, I passed the first time with flying colors. Okay, you don't feed your kids, you neglect them, you beat them, and protective services have come and taken your kids away from you. No, I'm a good mother. I said, okay, well, help me out here. I'm not finding the failure. Are you? And she's like, oh, no, I guess not. So we've got to line our minds up with what's true in order to be as healthy as possible. And that's one of the things that I work on clients with, is how to examine your thoughts and line them up with what's true. Our thoughts can cause so much anxiety, so much depression. If we think we're a failure, that's very depressing. So, okay, I'm looking at the time. So that's the mind. Now I'm going to talk about our spirit. Denying truth keeps us in bondage and continues to contributes to ill health. For those of us who are believers in Christ, we're trying to live our lives in ways that are pleasing to the Lord. We ought to know that we cannot divorce our thoughts and behaviors from godly precepts and think that it's going to turn out well for us. 1 Corinthians 11:27 through 29 tells us, if we take communion unworthily, meaning that if we make no attempt to repent and confess, that guilt will be assigned and judgment will come on us. Verse 30 says it this way, that's why many of us are weak and ill and why some of us have died. That's how strongly God cares about us healing and how strongly he wants us to be right before him to the best of our ability. Like, no one's perfect. No one's going to be perfect this side of heaven. But when we know better, we do better, right? Haven't we all heard that saying in recent years? I'm here to tell you that being in habitual sin patterns are not going to give us peace of mind. I had a client once who came to me full of anxiety. And this is him walking in the door in our first session. I've had 3 therapists. How do I know you're going to be any different? I said, I don't know. I guess we'll find out. And, as it turns out, as we're proceeding through developing rapport, I'm getting to hear more about his issues, what he's dealing with. It becomes clear to me that his anxiety is mainly around his relationship with women. He's a single guy, professing believer. And I said to him one day, I have a question for you, and I don't know that you're going to like it. And I said, but when you have a girlfriend, do you sleep with her? And he's like, well, yeah. And I said, how do you expect to have ease of spirit when you're deliberately, willfully sinning against God, your body, and her body? Do you think God is just sitting on the throne going, oh, that save sex for marriage stuff, I didn't really mean that. I just want you to be happy. Of course not. God doesn't mean to be a cosmic killjoy, but he knows what's going to hurt us. And he doesn't want us to partner with hurting ourselves. So when I asked him that question, this was his response. I never thought of it that way. I said, well, think of it that way. Like, God doesn't set boundaries in place for us because he doesn't want us to have a good life. He does it because he doesn't want us to get hurt. So if we don't take godly precepts and wisdom seriously, how can we expect to have peace of mind? How can we expect our bodies to be at ease? So that's just a snippet of how we have to address our faith in the Lord and our spirits. We need to treat that seriously. And just as an aside, I totally live in a glass house. I am not perfect. I have had loads of sin in my life. Hopefully I'm doing way better now than I ever did, but I'm not going to be perfect this side of heaven. And I never judge my clients. And I tell them, I'm not judging you. But I always will tell you the truth to the best of my ability because I want you to fulfill all the potential that God has for you, all the potential that he knit into you when he created you in your mother's womb. And if I don't tell you the truth, I'm going to have to answer for that to him when I stand before him someday. So that's just a snippet of spirit. I pray with clients, I give them spiritual exercises, I do healing prayer. There's lots of ways that I address this. And all the clients who come to me are seeking someone like me. They're not seeking secular counseling, they're seeking someone who integrates. So I'm not violating their boundaries, I'm not, going against any code of ethics or anything. This is what the people who seek me out want. So let's talk about the body. I had a new client the other day, and he told me that his body is in such a state of hypervigilance that when someone comes up beside him unawares, he has a startle response. That's trauma that's rooted down in the body. We can see that in soldiers and first responders, but we also see that in people who are victims of sexual abuse as children. And, that autopilot response, that knee-jerk response, zaps us. It is a cortisol response. Cortisol shoots up into the brain to activate the brainstem fight or flight response. There's no thought associated with that. It just happens. But if it happens over and over and over again, then we end up with adrenal fatigue. And adrenal fatigue can lead to chronic fatigue. And so that's the impact of trauma on the body over time. 1 Corinthians 6:19 says, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You're not your own. And because we belong to God, we owe it to him to steward all things he gives to us, including our bodies." Careful to point this out because, as you can see, I'm overweight. And for me, it's not just as simple as being disciplined in my eating. It's not as simple as mind over matter. When I was a tiny child, my pediatrician put me on penicillin for 2 years. He wrecked me. He wrecked my immune system. He wrecked my digestive system. And I struggled with digestive issues, respiratory issues, migraines, allergies, all kinds of things. And it had a mood impact, in addition to the other things that I experienced. By the time I was 18, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid problem, and it's an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases are caused by stress. At age 23, I was given a diagnosis for what happened to me because of being on antibiotics for those 2 years. And the treatment that I was given at that time caused me to lose 35 pounds in 1 month. And so it wrecked my metabolism. And I've never been able to fully control my weight. Even though I've tried keto, I've tried paleo, I've tried whatever, I've tried it, But it doesn't stop me from pursuing balancing my gut. Our gut is our enteric nervous system, also known as the gut brain. And if we have gut dysbiosis, meaning it's out of balance, we're not absorbing any vitamins or minerals from the food that we're eating, our gut wall is permeable, it can lead to a lot of other autoimmune disorders and other issues. So, in my pursuit, I gave up artificial sweeteners and drinking pop and, eating mostly organic. So there were a lot of things that I began to pursue. At the same time, in 2002, I started advanced training in the mood-food connection, the enteric nervous system. Right now, I'm working on an advanced certification as an integrative medicine provider for mental health because I want to be able to ethically talk to my clients about the things that they're eating, drinking, what they're doing to promote health in their bodies. There are research studies that show that a profound vitamin D deficiency can look like psychosis. A profound magnesium deficiency, it looks like depression. And when given proper dosing, that depression can remediate in 7 days. That's if there's a magnesium deficiency. I had a client struggling with OCD who, I was asking her, how much water do you drink in a day? Less than 20 ounces, she said. I said, your cells are anxious. Our bodies need way more water than that just to function properly. So there's a lot of things that we can do physically that can aid in healing of the body and healing of our mental health issues. I'm going to jump ahead and just say, I think it's irresponsible to be prescribed a medication when a doctor doesn't ask you, what do you eat, what do you drink, how are you sleeping, because all of those things are the baseline for our health. Now, if you're on a medication, I'm not saying get off your medication, but I'm saying maybe get blood work done and see if there's any vitamin or mineral deficiencies that can be remediated, because then you're actually creating health and not just managing symptoms. So there you have it. In two nutshells, I guess, mental health issues start with our histories. They take root in our bodies and minds, but they can be healed by the Lord using targeted interventions that address each aspect of our personhood. God wants us healed. God wants us healed. What's he going to get more glory out of? Leaving us stuck or setting us free? He wants to set us free. So I tell my clients, Philippians 1:6, you can be confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. You simply cannot walk the healing path toward Jesus and not get healing. He already won it for you. He wants you to have it. Not saying it isn't a hard journey. Sometimes it's painfully hard digging through the things that took root in us in the past. But my goodness, in Psalm 34, it says, taste and see that the Lord is good. And once you get a taste of healing and freedom in your mouth, you are going to want more. Come on, let's go get your healing.
I'll grab this one. We're going to let Daphne catch her breath for a second. Great job. Oh, my goodness. What I love about Daphne is she does kind of say it like it is, and she's just going to give it to you straight. And that recognition that our mental health has way more to do than just our mind. And so I hope today you've got some nuggets. I saw a lot of people taking a lot of notes out there today, and I love that. So I told you we're going to do a quick giveaway, and here's what we're going to do today. If this is your first time at a Lunch and Learn at Wooddale, would you just stand up really quick? Okay, first time Lunch and Learn at Wooddale, because one of you is winning this giveaway today, okay? So first of all, hey, great job. We're going to give you a hand for being here today. This thing just keeps growing. All right, if you have a birthday in the month of, what are we in, April? Keep standing, all right? So if you have an April birthday, keep standing. The rest of you can have a seat. Oh. Excellent. If you have a birthday in the month of August, oh, no, here we go, right here. We've got a winner. All right, happy birthday, and thanks for being here today. There you go. Yeah. So just a little bit of a preview for what's ahead really quick, and then we'll get to our Q&A. So if you've got some questions, I'm going to try to come out to you as close as I can get to ask that. But the next slide just kind of shows the next few weeks here at the Lunch and Learn. We did have one change to the schedule, and that is, we can't get there. That's all right. You have your schedule on your tables there. First week in May, John Odom was scheduled to talk about cardiovascular events. We are actually going to postpone that and move that to later because that is the National Day of Prayer, and we have another event that is happening here that day and don't want to have two competing events at the same time. So I apologize for the May 4th event. If you were looking forward to that one, that will be coming back up. Ken Castor is here next week. Ken is has a doctorate degree in youth ministry, loves hanging out with students, leads Wooddale's entire Next Gen ministry, and he's going to talk about crazy by design. Your students are supposed to be that way, and so kind of talking about those teenage years, and if you've got kids or grandkids, great one. Lynn Richter is going to be talking about walking with people through trauma the following week. Lynn just got her master's degree in the area of trauma, and anyway, it's going to be fantastic. There's some other great events. And then this summer, again, we are going to continue Lunch and Learn, so just a little bit to tell you some of the things that are going to be coming up this summer. We're going to have one on dealing with difficult people, a faith survival survivor guide for kids. So for parents, we're going to have a few events that you can actually bring your kids to. We're going to do a fun lunch and learn. We've got some pickleball courts out there. We're going to do an introduction to pickleball with the Oslins, and they are a couple that love pickleball, and we're going to have a little pickleball video followed by get out there and play. And so that'll be in June. We've got a couple weeks ago, somebody said, hey, would you do something for kids who are getting ready to go to college or even junior high and high school students to teach them how to budget now? And so that when they get to college, they have some tools. So we are going to do a college budgeting, or introduction to budgeting seminar for kids going to college, junior high, high school, and come with your parents kind of deal. Stacia Christensen's going to be talking about overcoming toxic thinking. Jess Bollett's going to be doing a dynamic life changes in young families. Todd Mulliken will be back this summer talking about overcoming anxiety in yourself and your kids. How to spiritually thrive during the college years with James Medina, who leads Destino, which is Cru's college ministry. We're going to have some life stories. We're going to invite some incredible speakers who have some amazing life stories, whether it's in leadership or families. And so I've got an invitation out to the founder of United Healthcare, who attends Wooddale, and his story is amazing. He's 88 years old, one of my mentors in life, and I want you to hear from him. And so, Kyle Robinson, who worked with Strength Finders for years, is going to talk about how do you help your kids discover their strengths, and lots more coming this summer. So be on the lookout. You'll see the complete schedule that will be online coming up. But Daphne, again, great job.
Thanks.
And we want to give some people a chance to ask some questions. So if you've got a question for Daphne today, would you go ahead and raise your hand, and I will try to see if we can get this to you somewhere. All right, in the back. And why don't you just stand up, and I will repeat your question for the people who are maybe going to watch this online later. Okay, the question is, Daphne, have you written any books?
I have a YouTube channel that has a couple little videos on it. I'm thinking about doing more, but I'm not really expert at like editing videos and things like that. So I'm trying to figure out the best use of my time and how to make that happen. I wrote a Bible study on spiritual disciplines with a friend of mine several years ago. God has asked me to write a healing workbook, and so I'm in the process of outlining that.
Fantastic. Yeah. Be on the lookout, and we will, when that happens, definitely be sharing that news. All right, somebody else. Question. Yes?
Just curious, as a licensed professional, are you restricted to working with clients just in those states that were mentioned?
Okay, so the question was, as a licensed professional, are you limited to the states where you're currently working, or can you work in any state?
Ethically, I can only work with clients who are in the states where I have a license. Yeah.
And those states?
There is a interstate compact for psychologists, and counselors have introduced legislation that is here in Minnesota and many other states to have an interstate compact, which would increase accessibility, and I would be able to work with more clients when that legislation passes.
So currently those states, if you were referring someone,
Yeah.
need to be in.
Florida, Maine, Michigan, and Minnesota. Yeah, I actually have been doing telehealth since 2010. So long before the pandemic, I started doing it because I lived in Michigan. I grew up in Michigan, and weather and illness, and so I would tell clients, if you feel like you're getting sick, just go home. If you feel well enough for your appointment, we can still meet online, or if the weather's bad, go home. We'll meet online. And so I was ready to roll into the pandemic when it came up and smacked us.
All right. Somebody else? Yes, Steve.
Comment and a question. First of all, I thank you for your presentation. I thought it was phenomenal.
Thank you.
I love the way you deal with someone who says, I can't forgive myself. Because I don't see a category for that in Scripture. It's all vertical and horizontal. And you magnify the grace of God by doing that. So thank you. I love the way you did that.
Thank you. Thank you.
The second thing is has to do with practice of repressed memories. So I've heard of people who their licensed therapists to help them uncover repressed memories, and some of these repressed memories may or may not be true. How do you sort that out?
Well, the Lord showed me a long time ago not to go after specific memories, but instead to ask the Holy Spirit to surface what needs to come to the surface in order for that healing to take place. Because we don't have to uncover everything in order to receive healing for many things. And so I'm actually someone who had repressed memory. I was molested when I was 14, and I almost promptly repressed it. I didn't remember again until I was in therapy in my mid-20s. And when I remembered it, it was like it happened all over again. It was really bad. But God brought it to light. You know, it wasn't us digging and digging and digging, because that can be really traumatic. So that's just the way that God has wired me. Yeah.
Good question. Marcy?
So we have two adopted granddaughters that have both been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder. And I'm wondering if you just have some basic tips on anything we as grandparents can do or not do.
Okay, so the question is about reactive
attachment disorder.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, reactive attachment disorder. So that is what I was talking about earlier, about an attachment wound that probably took root in utero. Adoption, because I worked in adoption, I'm really familiar with it, and it's a super tender subject in any member of the adoption triad: the birth mother, the child, the adoptive family. And I'll say that it requires careful handling on all three of the levels that I've talked about, because the trauma is so deeply rooted. Their emotional dysregulation is so extreme that they have to learn to feel safe in their own body. Now, there's a psychologist, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score, and it talks about this in depth. And I'm actually doing his certification program too. I could stay up 24 hours a day doing certifications, but it profoundly impacts the body, which impacts the mind and the behaviors, and so it really needs a multi-pronged approach. But in terms of grandparents, is just making sure they feel as safe as possible around you. Just giving them love. Love is very healing, but they really need good clinicians and maybe even healing prayer. That's what I would say.
All right. We may have time for two more. So anybody else? Steve?
Have you had people come in through experiences where somebody's going through something deep and it's complex, and the people around are maybe wanting to help, trying to help, but things are too simple, because the answers might be too cookie cutter for those types of situations?
You mean that the family, so the question is, okay. Okay, so sometimes when people are going through extreme trauma or they're in recovery, and their family members say, well, you should just do this or you should just do that. So I would say to a client, it's never pleasant when someone shoulds on us, is it? Yeah, so I will coach clients to say things like, it's not that simple. And that's not a helpful response, because if I could do that, I already would have done that. So, I'm seeking help. I'm working with the therapist, and I know I'll get there. But in the meantime, this is what support looks like to me. Is if you say, I love you, I'm praying for you, what can I do to help you? Is there something that, yes. Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Last question. Anybody else? Yeah.
We have a high schooler, middle schooler, elementary schooler who have exhibited
Oh,
All right, the question was, we have a high school, middle school, elementary school student who have all displayed different levels of anxiety. As a parent, what's the best thing we can do not to screw them up too much,
Yeah.
right? Is that what I heard?
yeah. Well, first of all, God bless you. That's hard, because when you see your kids struggling, that hurts. You don't want your kids to struggle. You wish you had the answers and you could solve the problem, right? So first of all, let me just affirm that. Well, I would say, if possible, that they could have a counselor that they could talk to, someone who is really expert at working with kids to find out what's at the root. Like I said, little kids learn to believe all kinds of things that aren't true, that are, working on them all the time. And so, my family moved here from Michigan in 2008, my brother and his wife, and they rudely brought my nephews with them and took them away from me. But my 12-year-old nephew was full of anxiety, worrying whether he was going to be able to make friends. And I said to him, well, how did you make friends before? And he said, well, in school and playing sports. And I said, are you going to be doing those things when you move to Minnesota? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, are you kind of the same kid that you have been all along that allowed you to make friends? And he said, well, yeah. And I said, so what makes you think you're not going to be, if you're doing the same things in the same way, that you're not going to be able to make friends? And he was like, oh. So, even just finding out what your kids are thinking and helping them to line their minds up with what's true.
Awesome. Thank you, Daphne. Here's what we're going to do. It's 1 o'clock, and I want to make sure that those of you who need to get back to work or other engagements can do so. Are you willing to stick around a little bit if people have questions? So Daphne will stay up here if you've got questions. But just to all of you, I want to say this. Some families have a little bit of a stigma when it comes to seeing a counselor or therapist. One of the greatest gifts you can give to yourself sometimes, to your spouse, or to your kids can be the gift of therapy. I grew up in sixth grade. I was a suicidal sixth grader. I kept it from my parents. They knew that something was wrong, but didn't quite know what that was. And I faced that alone. And I think about now what a gift it would have been to have been able to talk with somebody, to be able to have them share with me that, Brian, what you're going through is pretty normal, and here's some tools that you could have in your arsenal to face some of that stuff. Listen, the healthiest people I know see a counselor at least once a year. I don't know how you can make it through 365 days without some sort of trauma, some sort of pain, some sort of challenges coming into your life. The Bible even tells us there's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. This is not a new profession, and so if you struggle with that, literally, the church that I grew up going to said that counseling was something that only weak Christians do, and that you should be able to handle it with the Bible, with prayer, and with a pastor. And listen, we need that multitude of counselors. And so if that's something you struggle with, or you'd like to just talk with somebody about that, again, in the last month, over 14 people have been able to begin to find some healing through referrals to counselors. Daphne is a fantastic counselor. She's already told you she specializes in particular areas, and there are some people that she'd recommend to other counselors. What I love about Daphne is she is a counselor who has partnered with other Christian counselors. I believe that the best counseling you can get is Christian faith-based counseling. Because when you go to a counselor that maybe doesn't share that conviction that healing ultimately comes through Jesus Christ, we're going to maybe fall a little bit short there. And that doesn't mean you can't ever use a secular counselor, but without Jesus being part of that solution, I think that solution is a little bit short. Daphne, as somebody who's been a networker, has actually led the Christian counselor network in our area. So she knows lots and lots and lots of great Christian counselors, and it could be a great referral source for some of you as well. Okay, so thanks for coming. And next week, Crazy by Design. Your students are supposed to act that way with Ken Castor. Thanks for being here.